Yeah, this is joint work with my advisors, Steve Chase and Byron Yu, and we're collectively in electrical engineering and biomedical engineering. And we're really interested in neuroscience applications in machine learning, and specifically in the neuroscience of movement. So how does your brain make your body make all the really cool motions that you can do? So I'm going to talk a little bit about state space control and a cool kind of problem that has come up to us in neuroscience. And just interrupt if anything's unclear or if you can't hear me, move up to the front. I'll try to project, but my voice is not the strongest today. So in a typical control problem, you'll have some dynamics function, f, and you'll have states, x, that evolve according to these dynamics with some control inputs, u. And then typically when you're doing control, you want to do something like minimize some cost function of these states and controls. So the super classic problem is the optimal feedback control problem, which says if you know the dynamics and you know the cost function, find the optimal control signals and the states that those control signals will result in. And so this is super classic when f is linear and j is quadratic. This is solved exactly and efficiently by LQR, which is ubiquitous in control. This is why airplanes stay in the air and things like that. And about 20 years ago, people started asking kind of the inverse question, which is what if you could observe those control signals and you kind of assume that they're optimal under some cost function, but you want to learn that cost function. So a full application might be, say you have like limited access to an expert like a pilot, and he can provide you with control signals, and if you could extract a cost function that kind of summarizes the pilot's knowledge, then you could fly that airplane without the pilot. If you learn that cost function, then you go backwards and plug that into optimal feedback control. So we took this kind of in a slightly different direction. And we're interested in a control system where there's a human or an animal in the control loop. So let's suppose we're talking about me and I'm controlling my arm. So the idea is that I have some internal model of my arm's dynamics, and that helps me kind of choose the appropriate control signals to send from my brain to my arm. And this is interesting because the dynamics model in my brain doesn't always have to match the actual dynamics of my arm. So my arm might have some different dynamics. So here I'm distinguishing these two dynamics models. F1 is the model in my brain, and F2 would be the actual model, so how my arm actually works. And I might have these X's, which might be my internal beliefs about the state of my arm. And those might be different from the actual states of my arm, which I'm denoting by Y. And this is interesting because when you have a human or an animal in the control loop, there's typically a feedback delay. So if we're talking about me controlling my arm and I'm using visual feedback to kind of update my beliefs about the state of my arm, then it takes about 100 milliseconds for information from my retina to be available in the motor parts of my brain. So the idea is that if I have a good model of how my arm responds to control signals, and I have like a snapshot of where my arm was 100 milliseconds ago from my delayed feedback, and if I have some recollection of the control signals that I've sent over the past 100 milliseconds, then I could kind of propagate those through my internal dynamics model to get an estimate of where my arm is right now, which my feedback can't give me on its own. And so in this framework, there will also be some notion of a cost function that I'll talk about in specifics a little later. But the actual question we want to solve is, if we're given the actual states of the system, and we're given the control signal sent by the subject, and we know something about the cost function, can we estimate what the subject believes the dynamics are, and the subject's beliefs about the state of the system? And we're also going to be interested in trying to learn the feedback delay that's tau from data. So does this problem statement make sense to everybody? So just an outline of where we're going. That was the problem statement. I'm going to introduce the data that we're interested in applying this to. So I'll give a little primer on the neuroscience of movement, and then I'll talk about where we get our data from, which is a brain-machine interface setup, which is this full system. I'll talk in more detail, but basically we have a monkey with an array of electrodes in the brain, and by modulating neural activity being recorded by those electrodes, the monkey can move like a computer cursor on a screen or a robotic arm. And we're interested in learning the monkey's internal model of the system that he's trying to control. So then I'll show you guys the framework that we've developed to solve this problem. And I'll show you guys some results on that brain-machine interface data. So, neuroscience of movement. So here's just like a really simple movement example to motivate this problem. So let's say I have a computer cursor here, and I want to open up my email, so I'm going to move the cursor to the right. But then I realize, wait, I have to give a talk today, I got to make some figures in MATLAB, so then I decide to move the cursor up to MATLAB. So this is looks like a relatively simple movement, but here I've ignored the fact that we have this feedback delay. So if this is a really fast movement, then when the cursor is down here, my feedback alone might be telling me that the cursor is back here at the red dot. And if I were to aim straight to my target, my MATLAB target from where my feedback is telling me the cursor is, I'm going to aim up and to the right, and that command is going to be applied to where the cursor actually is right now. And that's going to drive the cursor up and to the right. And so if I continue with this strategy of just aiming for my outdated feedback, then I'm going to do something like this, and I'm going to miss the target. So we all make rapid, accurate movements, but we don't make errors like these typically when we're moving our arm to pick up a cup of coffee or something. And one way to get around this type of error is to use an internal dynamics model like we've been talking about. So in this little toy example, the internal model would estimate the current cursor position based on your delayed sensory feedback and some knowledge of the control signals that you've recently sent. So this internal dynamics model is kind of this cool construct in the brain, we think. And so the brain says, sensory feedback, the cursor is right. I recall that I've just sent a bunch of signals to move to the right. And if my internal dynamics model is accurate, then, so that's what we were denoting by F1, then I should be able to predict that in fact the cursor moved to the right. And this enables me to aim straight to the target from where the cursor actually is, rather than from the outdated feedback. And so that's how we can get this nice crispy movement that I showed earlier. So this kind of forward prediction framework is required whenever you want to make an accurate movement, a fast, accurate movement when there's a feedback delay in your system. So what if my internal dynamics model doesn't match the actual system of me? So then we can run into some cool problems, and those are actually what we're really interested in studying in neuroscience. So what if my internal model says that I move like down and to the right instead of straight to the right? So then I'm going to aim straight to the target from down here, and that gets applied to where the cursor actually is. But remember, my dynamics model is wrong, so I thought the cursor was going to take this like up slightly to the right trajectory, but because of the way my dynamics model is run, the cursor is actually going to go up and to the left a little bit. So you start right away getting into some really funky areas. You can see why this would be a really big problem, when you're trying to take a sip of coffee or something. So there's a lot of evidence of these models in neuroscience. A lot of human behavioralists have studied this kind of stuff, just studying the movement of the arm. And also neurophysiologists have done some experiments in monkeys, and they can find kind of correlates of these internal models and these copied control signals that would be necessary for you to send into your internal dynamics model for you to get these up-to-date estimates of your arm position. Or people study eye movements a lot in neuroscience, so some of this work is on eye movements. So we're going to try to extend some of this into the realm of brain-machine interface control. So I'm going to talk to you guys about that for a second. So in a brain-machine interface, we typically have a monkey, and he's got one of these 100 electrode arrays implanted in his motor cortex. That's part of the brain that's responsible for coordinating movement. And on each of those electrodes, you'll record a voltage signal. And kind of the most important element of that voltage signal is called a spike. So that's when you have a huge, relatively large deflection of the voltage over about a second. And in neuroscience, it's widely believed that these spikes are pretty much what carries all the information computed and transferred in the brain. So we record voltage signals from all these electrodes, and then we parse those into the times at which spikes occurred. So these are called spike trains. And then we'll typically bin those spike trains into, say, 30 millisecond bins, where we'll just count the number of spikes off each electrode in those 30 milliseconds. And then we can send those spike counts to a decoding algorithm, and that can produce a velocity output signal that can be used to drive a cursor on a computer screen or a robotic limb or something like that. And then this is, of course, a closed-loop feedback system, because the monkey gets to see the state of the arm or the state of the cursor on the screen and then decide the next control signal to send, essentially. So putting this back into the language that I introduced earlier, these neural commands that we're recording from the electrode array, those are going to be the control signals U. And so that's going to be, say, if I have 100 electrodes, it'll be a spike count vector 100 by 1 at each time step. And then the decoding algorithm is instantiating these actual system dynamics, F2. And in our experiments, we typically set that to be linear, just because that there's kind of a lot of neuroscience theory studied that shows that decoders can be well controlled when they're linear. And then the output of that decoder is going to be, in our case, the cursor position, so that's Y. And then remember, there's this feedback delay, so at time t, the subject observes the cursor position tau time steps away. So just so you guys, so then F1, the actual system dynamics, and the subject's internal beliefs about the state of the cursor. These F1 and X, those are somewhere in the brain, presumably. And so we want to, basically the setup is we want to learn something about what's going on in the brain that we can't observe directly. We want to learn something about that based on all the stuff that we kind of have direct access to in our experiments. So here are a bunch of example cursor trajectories during one of these experiments. So here you see 16 targets, and the monkey, basically one of these flashes up at a time, and the monkey then drives the cursor to that target. And you can see these movements are relatively straight, and they're also relatively quick. The average movement time is just under a second in these experiments. So the monkey has pretty good control over this cursor just by modulating the activity of his motor cortex neurons. So the first question we wanted to ask before kind of getting into finding a solution to this control problem was just to ask, is it reasonable to think that the monkey actually uses an internal dynamics model when he's controlling this cursor? So we did this kind of simple analysis where we took a bunch of trajectories from these cursor experiments, and we looked at them time step by time step, and we'd say at a particular time step, say when the cursor's here, and the decoded velocity signal is in this direction, we would say, well, the monkey can't directly observe where the cursor is right now because there's this feedback delay, but rather he can only directly observe where it was a few time steps ago. So we'll take this command and we'll shift it to originate from a position a few time steps earlier. And then we'll ask, from where is this command, where does it seem most appropriate? Where did the monkey think the cursor was when he sent this control signal? And what we find is these commands point straighter to the target when they originate from the current cursor position rather than from an outdated position. And so, because the monkey can't observe that current position due to the feedback delay, this kind of implies that he's using some sort of forward prediction, which means that maybe it's okay for us to go ahead and study that. Yes?
So like this trajectory was just show it to monkey, or monkey did it?
Yeah, so the monkey controlled this whole thing. So the cursor would say start out here, and then in 30 milliseconds, we would record the spikes off of the array, and then run that through the decoding algorithm, and that would give us the next position. And then 30 milliseconds later, record again, and just so that the monkey is actually driving every single step of this cursor.
To use the hand to control it, or
No, so it's really cool. The monkey's sitting with his hands not moving at all, and he's just modulating the activity in motor cortex, and where we basically learn how the monkey wants to move the cursor based on those modulations, and then we make it so. Does that make sense?
So your data is at 30 hertz?
Yes. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about how we how we solved this problem. So just to remind everyone, this is a problem statement. So to kind of align this with our brain-machine interface data, we're given the actual states of the system. So those are the BMI cursor trajectories, the Ys. We're given these recorded neural commands. Those are the control signals U. And we're given the target functions, which I haven't talked about yet. So we're going to denote those as G. And that's kind of going to inform our assumptions about the cost function. We're basically going to assume that the monkey wants to drive the cursor straight to the target at every time step during the experiment. And we want to find that the subject's internal model of the cursor dynamics. So that's F1. And we want to find where does the monkey think the cursor is at every time step during the experiment. And we'll also try to learn the feedback delay. So we devised a probabilistic framework to solve this problem. So just to give you the intuition behind the framework first, here's an example cursor trajectory. Let's just say that the feedback delay is 2 time steps, just for illustration here. So this would be kind of where the cursor actually moved during these 2 time steps, and the monkey was trying to bring the cursor to this target over here. So remember that the cursor actually evolved according to the true dynamics. Those are F2. And in our framework, the subject begins with this outdated feedback, and then propagates that forward according to his internal dynamics model, that F1. And so that results in his internal beliefs about where the cursor is, which might be different from where the cursor actually is. So now the monkey has this up-to-date estimate of where he thinks the cursor is. And because we believe he's trying to drive the cursor towards the target, if we look at the next recorded command, we should have this intuition that the monkey's trying to use that to drive the cursor to the target. So if we propagate that next recorded command through the actual system dynamics, maybe it moves the cursor along this black dashed line. But propagating that through the monkey's internal model should bring the monkey's belief about where the cursor is closer to the target, and specifically straight towards the target. So, as you guys maybe have guessed, we're going to treat these internal state beliefs as latent variables. And they get initialized just by exactly matching the feedback. And then we let them evolve according to a Gaussian linear dynamical system. So the monkey's internal belief about where the cursor is at one time step is just a linear function of where it was at the previous time step and the previously issued control signal. So these parameters, these A and B parameters, those are kind of the parameters that we're most interested in learning and studying. So those kind of parameterize the dynamics model, and to get some traction on those, we impose an observation model, which encodes this assumption that the monkey is trying to move the cursor straight to the target. So here we say the target position ought to lie basically on a line defined by these last 2 points in the internal state chain. So this right side of the equation is just an expression for a line that starts at xt and goes in the direction defined by these last 2 points. And the length of the line is determined by this alpha parameter, which is just some scale parameter that we can learn from the data so that this line kind of ends in the right place.
Right, so is this an assumption that the monkey is trying to move it in a straight line towards the target at all times?
Yes.
So your so there when you represent your internal state x, you've given it for the next time step. So you have a linear model to take it to the next time step.
Right.
But in your case, for example, in this particular case, where there are 2 time step delays, then the monkey has to have some notion of a control law which it will use to find the next xt. In this particular case, you start with xt minus 2, you have xt minus 1 from the current control law,
Right.
but then you're going to continue doing that. So there's also a control sequence.
Right. Right. So this is basically a recursive update where you start here where you have, we're assuming right now you have perfect knowledge of where the cursor was. And then you can run through this equation once to get this estimate, then run through again to get this, and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so at each time step, you're taking the same control signal that actually moved the cursor along the trajectory that the monkey actually sees. So that same control signal runs through the monkey's internal model here versus the true cursor dynamics here.
I see.
Okay, so and this observation model basically is just encoding the cost function that we're kind of imposing. So we can kind of summarize all of this in terms of a graphical model. So here's that feedback, yt minus 2, and I'm indicating that as a shaded node because that's observed to us. And so the monkey propagates his internal state estimates forward in time using that internal dynamics model. And in each time step, he's integrating the most recently issued control signal, which are also observed to us. And then we have this observation model, which says that the target ought to lie somewhere on the line defined by these last 2 internal state estimates. So at this point, you have a question?
Oh yeah. So the model doesn't say the monkey like sees new positions of the cursor and integrates that into new states.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say next.
Oh, sorry.
So question.
Yes.
So you have this normal distribution. So how do you choose the variances for that?
Yeah, so we can learn all that from the data.
Okay.
So I'll talk about that in a minute as well.
Again, I'm just trying to understand the forward prediction. So at any given time, let's say you are at t minus 2, you are at t minus 2, then you're trying to predict what will happen in the next 2 time steps. Is that how it's going? Or
So actually, you're sitting at time step t,
and you
but
have
because you have this feedback delay, it takes some time for the visual information to get to the right part of your brain. So you're sitting at time step t, and you say, well, my feedback that's in the motor part of my brain right now says that the cursor's back here. So you basically want to reach back in time and pull it forward based on your knowledge of the control signals that you sent.
And this is, since it's post-processing, you already have this information.
Exactly.
So I think the monkey's internal model is pretty static, like he's not learning as he practices.
Yeah, you guys ask all the right questions. So especially in neuroscience, we're really interested in studying learning. So that's going to be kind of a future direction that I'll talk about. But right now, we're assuming that I'm basically looking at data sets where the monkey has really stable performance. So we assume that his internal model is relatively static during that time.
So just maybe quick question, maybe you answered this earlier, but so where does the F2 come, the actual dynamic model? Is that something that, since you don't see it doing any joystick area, where does the F2 come from?
Yeah, so we'll basically at the beginning of every experiment we have like a calibration session where we just show the monkey the cursor moving to the different targets, and we recorded the neural activity while that's happening, and then basically we just do a regression to say what does neural activity look like when the cursor is moving in this direction. And then we can use that to instantiate some actual dynamics of the cursor. And then we can give the monkey control of the cursor, and then the F2 basically becomes live. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it's kind of like doing the supervised learning thing where we could have let the monkey move his arm and see what his neurons do when he moves to the right and when he moves up, and then we could try to predict, is he moving to the right or is he moving up? So that prediction is essentially the F2 that we impose.
Are there any assumptions underlying this that monkey is actually thinking about the cursor and not about the banana?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you have to, any data that you're going to use when building that F2, you need to levy some assumptions like the monkey's trying to move straight to the right.
So at each instant, the GT is different.
So in each trial, GT will be the same.
The target is shown, but as you move in time, GT is a function of xt plus 1. I mean, at just the next step. Doesn't that mean that GT is different even if it's the same trial?
Yeah. So GT is an observed variable, and we'll basically set GT to the actual position of the cursor in each trial. So there may be 20 time steps where GT takes on the position at this up here versus a different position. Okay, so I think this was Brendan's question. So this is all just happening at one kind of instant in the monkey's brain. The monkey's saying, okay, where was the cursor? What did I just send? Where should the cursor be right now? And then at the next time step, the monkey receives a new visual feedback. And now we give the monkey we're assuming that he revises his internal state estimates. So we introduce new latent variables to represent those. And so this kind continues backwards and forwards throughout time. Does that make sense?
So another question. So what is the influence of U to X? Is that the neural control is affecting the monkey's brain states? Or is it?
Yeah, so it's the monkey's using his internal dynamics model. He's running that control signal through it to get an internal prediction of where he thinks the cursor is.
So there's the electrodes don't just record, they also stimulate? Is that how it works?
No, so we're assuming that this is some process that just happens in the brain. So I could have given a little bit more background on this, but basically there's some evidence that as you move your arm around, for example, say I send a command to move my arm to the right, then my arm's going to move to the right, but it's going to do so kind of slowly, and it's going to take time for me to get feedback that, yes, my arm actually moved to the right. So basically when my motor cortex sends this signal, move to the right, to my arm, it also sends a copy of that signal somewhere else in the brain. And that somewhere else in the brain is maybe where this internal dynamics model lies.
Okay.
And so if you know, I just send a command to move to the right, then that model should be able to predict that you move to the right. And that way, you don't have to wait for that slow feedback to come. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like,
So U and X are both in the brain, such that U can be recorded like an experimenter.
right,
And X is an unknown latent brain representation of
right,
reality
exactly.
or something.
Exactly.
What are the superscript and subscript effects?
Yeah, so I guess for simplicity, before I wasn't using any superscripts there, but because at each time step there's a new row of these latent variables, now I'm using the superscript to index the row, and then the subscript indexes the time step at which that prediction is based upon. So before we were just looking at this state chain, and XTT would be at time step t, where does the monkey think the cursor is at time step t? Versus at time step t, where did the monkey think the cursor was one time step ago? Okay, so now that we've kind of expanded this over time, it looks a little bit complicated, but you guys will notice that we have observed all of these control signals that are actually linking these latent state chains together. So that means that those state chains are conditionally independent of each other given these control signals, which makes the model fitting a lot easier for us. So we wind up just taking a maximum likelihood approach and using EM to fit this model. And another nice feature here is that we can learn feedback delay from the data. So we were mostly talking about this example where there's a 2 time step feedback delay, but we can change that just by introducing additional latent variables in this chain. So there's a 3 time step feedback delay or a 4 time step feedback delay. So I'm just basically changing the amount of time between the feedback and the current time step here. And we can basically just do cross-validation or something and choose the model that gives the best cross-validated likelihood. Okay, so that's the model. I'm going to move on to the results unless you guys have any more questions. Did you have a question?
I was going to ask whether you're also going to try to learn the monkey's, the feedback signal that the monkey thinks you should be producing. In other words, to try to learn whether you want to learn the U that he's trying to produce, or
Yeah.
just the one.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We've toyed around with that a little bit. It winds up being really challenging just because there are so many factors that influence the activity of your neurons. And while we think that where he wants the cursor to go is one of those factors, it typically doesn't explain a substantial amount of the variance in the neural activity. So we can kind of run into some trouble if we impose assumptions there when we don't really know what's really controlling all of that variance.
Sure. Can the monkey control the speed or the speed of the cursor, or is it kind of capped?
Yeah, the monkey can control the speed.
So how many seconds or milliseconds does these 3 times step correspond to?
Yeah, so we use these 30 millisecond bins. It's 33 milliseconds actually, so 3 time steps would correspond to 100 milliseconds.
So in your case, you're assuming your G was basically the J cost function, right?
Right.
That's what you're assuming. So again, related to his question about learning the control law. Yeah, so there is a big assumption here. So you're assuming you know J.
Right.
You know the cost function and you're using it around that. But how far is that a valid assumption really? Because yeah, so that I think is very significant because it's
Absolutely. Yeah.
because like he's learning the cost function for this particular task, though however trivial you might think the task is still quite challenging. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is kind of our first pass at the problem. And ultimately, it would be really cool if we could jointly learn the cost function and the internal dynamics.
Or even some kind of iteration of like one first learn the internal dynamics model assuming a cost function, then learn the cost function assuming the internal dynamics and go back.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can kind of already do that with the methodology that's available, because if we can use this technique to learn the internal dynamics model, then we can go back to inverse optimal control and say, assuming this dynamics model, learn the cost function.
Right.
And go back and forth. So that's definitely something we're interested in trying, but we haven't yet. All right, so some results based on this framework. So I should have mentioned that when we do that model fitting, we find that a feedback delay of 3 time steps, or about 100 milliseconds, gives the best description of the data. That actually matches well with observations just in the neuroscience literature that basically say it takes about 100 milliseconds for visual information on the retina to get to your motor cortex. So that's kind of a nice sanity check. Tells us that our model fitting is doing something reasonable, perhaps. So I want to show you guys what we can do with this model. So here's an example of cursor trajectory. So the cursor started over here, and then the monkey modulated neural activity time step by time step, and move the cursor basically straight to the target in this trial. So again, the cursor is moving according to these actual dynamics, F2. And so let's look at a particular time step in this trial when the cursor was actually here. And based on what we learned that there's roughly a 3 time step feedback delay, then the monkey's feedback alone was saying that the cursor was back here. And now we've learned the F1 using this probabilistic model. And so this is the output of that F1. We take the same neural activity, the same U that brought the cursor from here to here to here to here, and rather than running that through F2, we run that through F1, and that gives us this red line. So now that this point here tells us this is our estimate of where the monkey thinks the cursor is at time step t. And then if we take the next control signal, the control signal that actually brought the cursor from here to here, and we run that again through the F1 that we extract, then you get this line, and it's kind of hard to say in this trial, is this reasonable or is this not reasonable? Because the actual cursor basically moved straight to the target, and it looks like the monkey believed the cursor was moving kind of straight to the target. So this is maybe not surprising. Across many more time steps in that trial, these are what those little F1 whiskers look like. And basically they all point kind of straight to the target, so does the cursor trajectory. So it looks like the monkey's internal model matches the actual cursor dynamics reasonably well in this trial. So what's more interesting to study is when there's some sort of error that the monkey's making. So here's a really circuitous cursor trajectory, and we might look at this trial and say, well, maybe the monkey was thinking about bananas or something, right, instead of moving the cursor. And then he fell asleep, and then he decided he wanted to hit the target and get his reward. So then he drove the cursor into the target. So let's see if we can kind of assess the validity of that statement. So again, if we think about a time step when the cursor was here, based on that 3 times that feedback delay, the monkey's feedback says that the cursor is back here. And now if we run the same neural activity that brought the cursor along this trajectory through F2, we run that through the F1 that we extracted, and here it looks really different. So here it basically points straight to the target, and if we take that next command, the command that brought the cursor from here to here, we run that through F2, and here it points basically straight to the target, which is very different from what the cursor actually did, which was move in this direction. So the way I'm going to quantify this across a lot of data is just by tallying up the angular errors with respect to the target of these commands through F1 versus these commands through F2, what the monkey actually saw. So in this case, if the cursor had continued along that dashed line, it would have missed the target by 45 degrees. So this is what those F1 whiskers look like throughout this whole trial. And again, you see this really interesting phenomenon, which is that when the cursor is not moving straight to the target, these F1 whiskers do. And also, when the cursor is moving straight to the target, these F1 whiskers also, they still move straight to the target. So we would have looked at this trial maybe before having this framework, and we might have thought that the monkey was thinking about bananas. But actually, based on this framework, we can say that the monkey was issuing appropriate control signals throughout this whole trial. It's just that those control signals were appropriate for the monkey's internal model of the decoder of the cursor, but less appropriate for the actual cursor dynamics. Yes?
So your plot seems a little confusing. So I'm trying to understand, isn't your F1 is your internal model, right?
Right.
So the internal model is constant for this entire trial.
Right.
Right. So shouldn't there be like one single X trajectory? Can you show one single X trajectory? Because shouldn't it be using the information from the previous internal states that it has learned?
Right. So remember back in the graphical model, these state chains, they each originate from the feedback, which in the previous slide was 3 time steps. So that's why they all start somewhere on the black trajectory. and then they evolve forward in time from that. So it's not that there's one long trajectory, it's that at each time step there's a
At
new-
every time step you are doing this,
Right.
but the model learn is for the entire trial and it's constant for.
Right, so the same F1 is governing basically each of these transitions across, at every time step. So in this, so here every single line segment is basically the output of the same F1.
So I'm trying to explain why this like internal model go to the target directly and the like actual model like the two. Maybe like so you said you also estimate your F2 function, this like actual function according to the actual movement.
Yeah,
So is it possible that this F2 is like not very correct?
yeah, so just to clarify, that F2 was estimated before the experiment started. Okay, then we ran the experiment, and then a couple years later, we ran this through this learning algorithm. So, so it looks like, so I think your intuition is correct that this F2, what the cursor actually did, was maybe not the best F2 that we could have chosen, because clearly it did the wrong thing when the monkey was trying to do the right thing, right? So we're actually interested in replacing that F2 with the F1 we learned through this algorithm and using that as the decoder in the experiments before the experiment starts.
So it looks like the assumption you make is that there's 100 milliseconds time delay and the A and B matrices are over that time span. Could it be possible that the planning is actually taking place over a longer horizon, like 200 or 300 milliseconds? Would that change anything? What, I mean, if you add that as another optimization parameter, do you think your conclusions would change?
So do you mean, so we did consider multiple feedback delays, is that what you mean?
What I'm trying to say is, though the latency is 100 milliseconds, I don't have to design a controller based on a 100 milliseconds
Sure.
delay. I can have like a 200 milliseconds delay considered into my, the model can be over 200 milliseconds, not over 100.
Sure, yeah.
Is that, so is it, am I correct in assessing that you assume that person is planning every 100 milliseconds?
Yeah, so that's the assumption that's put into the model, but it's certainly a simplifying assumption that enables us to do all this learning really attractively, efficiently. But it's definitely possible that the actual planning algorithm is, I mean, for sure it's a lot more complex than we're really giving credit to.
Is this for the same monkey, this one and the previous one?
It is the same one.
And what, you would not know the time between the two trials, or do you know?
I don't know it offhand,
Okay.
but just to give you an idea, they are from the same experiment, so it's within the same maybe 2 hours.
And when you said you're trying to look at learning, did you compare this F1 with the previous one? Or, I mean,
So they're actually the same F1.
oh,
So we'll learn one F1 for the whole experiment.
okay.
So you might be asking, why can the same F1 in some trials match the cursor trajectory, whereas in other trials it looks very different. And that's just because of the redundancy in the mapping. So these U's are these high dimensional, say 100 dimensional vectors, and then the states are these positions, which are just 2 dimensional. So you can think of examples where F1 and F2 are different, but you can pick some control signals, some U's, that will produce exactly the same output from both of them, even though F1 and F2 are different. You can also think of some U's that will produce the same output through these 2 different dynamics models. So just to summarize those results, so we were looking at the angular errors according to these F1 whiskers versus these F2, what the cursor actually did. And so now I'm looking over lots and lots of trials, about 6,000 of these trials, where actually only about 5% of them look like there are these kind of egregious errors in the cursor trajectory. And the rest of them look like they're basically straight to the target. And with that, these black errors are on average about 9 or 10 degrees. And with this framework, we basically can fit that dynamics model so that the output cross-validated is only about 2 degrees. So to put that another way, we can explain about 80% of the errors in the monkey's control based on learning a dynamics model that might not match the actual dynamics.
Since it's such this crisp processing, probably not. Have you looked at repeating the experiments with dramatically slowed dynamics? If you're claiming that the error is coming from the monkey not being able to process the visual feedback fast enough, what happens if you slow down the actual dynamics so that the time scale is much slower than the monkey's perceptual feedback? You get much lower errors.
Yeah, so we haven't done that experiment, but that's a really interesting question. My hypothesis is that you couldn't really do a lot of this analysis because if the cursor is moving slow enough, then the monkey doesn't really need to rely so heavily on an internal model because you can basically say, well, the feedback is here.
Sorry, the question was if you slow down the dynamics enough, that monkey doesn't need to rely on an internal model. Would the error in its the actual trajectory drop to what you would see corrected with the internal model? Basically, a way of validating that the internal model, errors in the internal model is actually what's producing your observed error, as opposed to just some sort of overfitting.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. We could definitely try that. We haven't done that. So you're saying move the cursor, let it sit there for maybe a second, just to make sure the monkey really knows the cursor's right here. Then record a 30 millisecond spike count, run that through the dynamics, and see that those have these low errors.
Yeah, like I said, just try to get rid of what you're saying is causing the error,
Yeah.
and then see if the error actually goes down, just as a sanity check / make sure it's not just having enough wiggle room in your internal model to account for, or alternatively, make sure that monkey is actually following your assumption of always trying to move towards the goal instead of something.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. So just to address that overfitting comment, all this is cross-validated, so we're never evaluating on trials that we trained on, so we're not really concerned about that. But yes?
I have a slightly related question. Could you test your time delay assumptions by artificially putting some time delay in, where you have an estimate of the true state of the system, but you don't actually display it for maybe 100 more milliseconds? Then that tau should be 200 milliseconds in the interim model, right?
Yeah, another great experiment. Yeah, it's a good idea.
Okay, just curious if you...
We haven't done that. All right, so just to summarize, so we asked this question, can we learn the subject's internal dynamics model? And we developed this probabilistic framework to kind of take a first pass at solving this problem. And we validated our framework on data from this brain-machine interface system. And just some future directions, which I think a lot of you guys have already been thinking about, is what about when the monkey's learning and his dynamics model might be changing. So especially when we're seeing really cool errors like that circuitous trial, when you make errors, you tend to learn so that you don't repeat the same errors. So it would be really cool to see the monkey make that mistake and then maybe look for a change in the internal model that might be associated with that error. And we're also interested in maybe exploring other application areas. So other applications where you have a human in the control loop, say like in telerobotic surgery or something where you need to train a surgeon to move some manipulandum so that across the country a scalpel goes and makes the right cut. So here's a place where you really don't want mistakes to happen, so you might want to invest in some technology that can train the surgeon to not make mistakes, so train him so that F1 and F2 match exactly in every case. So if you can extract the surgeon's F1, then you can say, you know, does that match the actual robot's dynamics? And if not, maybe we shouldn't let you do surgery yet, something like that. All right, so I'm just going to acknowledge Andy Schwartz. He runs a really cool monkey lab at the University of Pittsburgh, and he very generously gave us access to all the data that I showed you guys. All right, any other questions? Yes?
How do you actually convince the monkey to go for the task? Great.
Yeah, he gets a reward of juice. He gets a little drop of juice every time he hits the target. And monkeys love juice, so play this game all day long.
How long does it take for the monkey to learn the model?
So, what do you mean the model?
So how long does it take for the monkey to be proficient at the task?
Yeah, so there's substantial training involved just to get the monkey basically used to sitting in a chair and not moving his head and things like that. And that's typically done just training the monkey to move his arm to basically different targets in space. And once he understands that paradigm, then switching over to this brain control side where, you know, the position of his hand is irrelevant and all that matters is the neural activity, then you can often see him get it right on the very first trial, which is really cool.
So are the monkey's arms restrained during this, do you know, or so I'm just thinking like it would be a thing that would be hard to get at, but would be cool to find out is the monkey thinking about basically moving his arm, or imagining like a new limb that he can move to go and get the thing?
Yeah, sure. So that's a really tough question because we can't ask the monkey
Yeah,
what they're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly.
But there are actually human experiments with some of these same technologies that are in clinical trials right now. And there you can actually ask the human, what are you trying to do? Or you can tell the human, you know, imagine squeezing your arm or imagine a mountain or something like that. And then you can kind of get at some of those questions. But in these experiments, so different labs will do it differently. These experiments were run with the monkey's arms restrained, and he's not, you know, pushing against them noticeably.
Right. Yeah.
Other labs will have the monkey's arms just kind of sitting freely, and in that case, they typically don't move their arms because they basically figure out that moving my arm is just an extra cost, and I can do everything that I need to do just by sitting.
That's so cool. So it'd be interesting to look at like the speed they try to move it, and whether they kind of treat it as like a limb that has the same physical constraints as the arm. Because you can imagine the monkey could learn, oh man, I can really move this cursor really fast if I want to. But
yeah, absolutely. So cool. You can ask questions like, is the brain just tuned for what the body can do, or can the brain learn to do anything if you give it the right, you know, plant to control?
Is there evidence for people who like? So I suspect most people can like learn the correct actual model so that they can like, you know, point to something very quickly. Is there evidence for people who can't do that, or like monkeys that, you know, no matter how long I train them, they still like kind of spiral around until they get it, something like that?
Yeah. So I think the extension of that question is: are there some F2 that can be learned and some that can't be learned?
Yeah.
And my advisor Byron Yu is coordinating some experiments like that right now, where basically instantiate some class of F2 and see if the monkey can learn those, and then we have some hypotheses about different types of F2 that just basically because of the connectivity in the brain that they're just not controllable. And so we have some evidence along those lines.
Yeah, I was also thinking like people have neurological disorders, they can't learn specific F2s. So it's also you have to vary the subjects a little bit.
Yeah, it's possible. Yes?
Was this the only F2 tried in these trials?
So these experiments are across actually about a whole year, and every day there's a different F2.
I mean, independent of the mapping from the neural spikes. So you had a mapping directly from neural spikes to velocity, right, of the cursor. How about mapping to acceleration?
Yep. Yeah, so there's been a lot of research in the brain-machine interface community about what are the best decoders to use. So what's the best F2? And so people started out just with a position decoder. You just decode position. And then people added velocity, and they said, oh, the monkey does a lot better when you add velocity. And when you add acceleration, it turns out it doesn't help a whole lot. But people have kind of run the gamut on what should you be coding, what should you be decoding, and what should be the form of that decoder and so on.
With your particular data set, was it all velocity?
Yes.
So is this the same monkey in every experiment?
Yes.
Do you think that the mapping would transfer from one subject to another? You have to go through this training process every time?
Yeah, so it almost definitely does not transfer across monkeys, and the reason is because neurons are really, really small, and it's not clear that the neurons in my brain are the same as the neurons in your brain. So if you were to put an array in one monkey's brain, and then even if you tried really hard to put it in the same place in a different monkey's brain, there's no chance that you would be getting the same neurons across those. So that means kind of the control signals you're recording from each of those monkeys are going to be different. So that means they need to be interpreted differently.
So these electrodes are fixed, like throughout the year, the same sort of set of measurement.
Yeah, in these experiments, they're fixed on this electrode array.
So you did cross validation to choose the tau, like the delay is 3 times that, right? So how bad is it if you choose different tau? Because my guess is that suppose someone get drunk, right? Like he cannot walk straight because he probably has much slower or much higher delay, so that his internal control just cannot match the actual.
Yeah.
So I wonder, does it deteriorate very quickly as your delay increases? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think your question links up to what someone else asked earlier, which is can you impose additional delay?
Yeah.
And if you were to do that, I imagine you would see something that looks just like what you're saying. You might see the cursor moving along as if the monkey's drunk or something. But if we change in the model the tau, that doesn't mean the monkey has changed his feedback delay, right? So that's a slightly different question.
That's true.
And basically, within a couple bins, the model's not very, very sensitive to that choice of tau. All right, thanks so much.